So while we have the altar stripped for Good Friday, which is stripped on Maundy Thursday with the altar cloths removed, for a reason we'll get on to shortly, I thought it's a good opportunity to have a closer look and a little bit of a discussion as to what the altar is and some of its key features and some of its history as well. The first question to ask is, in a Christian church, Catholic Church, we've already gone into the history that this is essentially a Roman basilica. Why do we have an altar? What is an altar? Well, an altar is a table of sacrifice. For a sacrifice, you need a priest, you need a victim, and you need an altar. So, in a Christian context, what are we sacrificing? I'm a priest, I'm a sacrificing priest, a sacerdos in Latin. That's very much linked with the altar, obviously, and very much linked with the heart of our Catholic faith, which is the Eucharist. The altar goes back to Judaism, the role of the altar in the Passover festival, where the lamb was sacrificed and the flesh of the lamb was consumed ritually by a family alongside bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and 4 cups of wine. We can only understand the Last Supper and the Mass if we remember that both are founded on the key principle of the Jewish Passover, sacrifice followed by a meal to consume the flesh of the victim. On Maundy Thursday, Jesus put aside the 4th cup of wine to demonstrate that the crucifixion the next day was a continuation of the Last Supper. And when Jesus told us to do this in memory of him, it wasn't just looking back at a past event, but bringing that event into the present, under the sacramental signs of bread and wine. The remembrance that Christ talks of is a bringing of the entirety of the Last Supper, the crucifixion, and the resurrection into the here and now for us to participate in. Just as the lamb was sacrificed on the altar and then eaten at table, the Mass presents Jesus' sacrificed flesh and blood for us to eat and drink from the altar table, from the rising of the sun to its setting, from one generation to the next, until the end of time. Although we don't go directly up to the altar to receive communion, the whole theology of having altar rails was that they were an extension of the altar, not an obstacle to accessing it, so that by receiving communion at the foot of the sanctuary, we would have contact with the altar itself. In scriptures, in the New Testament, and the writings of the early church fathers of the first few centuries, we have a bit of an insight as to what they understood the Eucharist to be and how that developed into a rich theology of sacrifice. So the word altar comes from the Latin altare. There are 2 main nouns for altar, ara and altare. We use altare. Ara tended to be used more for pagan sacrifices. It was like the Ara Pacis in Rome, Augustus' altar of peace. So it had pagan associations. So Christians tended to veer away from using the word ara. But we still have theologians and Christians and church fathers from the late 2nd century to the early 3rd century, Tertullian being one, who uses ara to explain and to describe the Christian Eucharistic altar. St. Cyprian avoids the term and he compares altare, the Christian altar, with the ara of the pagan priesthood. But very much in the early church, this idea of a sacrificing table is very much in place. In the New Testament, there are 2 terms used to describe altars of sacrifice and the Eucharistic table. One is thysiasterion, which is very clearly a sacrificial altar, and the other is trapeza. And St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 uses this word trapeza to contrast the sacrificing trapeza, the altar of the pagans, to the trapeza, the sacrificing altar, the table of the Eucharist. We also see examples in Revelation 6 and Hebrews 13, where the Eucharistic table is linked with this thysiasterion, the sacrificial altar of the Old Testament. It's not just scripture, it's the early church, it's just one continuous testimony that the table of the Eucharist is both altar and it's also communion table. So it is the altar in which the sacrifice of Christ is represented, but it's also the table from which we receive, as the Jews did in the Passover feast, the flesh of the sacrificed lamb. But we receive that under the signs of bread and wine, but we receive the reality of Christ's flesh and his blood. We might be familiar with the practice of removing the altar cloths from the altar at Maundy Thursday, and that's a reminder of the stripping of Christ's garments during the arrest and handing over the Jews and the general abuse and torture that he suffered at that time. The altar cloths also have another symbolic meaning, that they are the burial shrouds of Christ, and they also symbolize the Christian faithful encompassing and shrouding Christ as well, but it has a symbology of the tomb. And the altar itself, as the Jewish altar in Jerusalem had symbology of representing God, so the altar represents Christ, the cornerstone. In the earliest centuries of the church, especially from the 4th century onwards, you had a lot of altars being highlighted by a big canopy called a ciborium, sometimes called a baldacchino as well. And this was again to emphasize the importance and the dignity of the altar in Christian worship. One of the things that might be most obvious about the altar is that it's made of stone. Now, obviously, the first altars that the early Christians, and in fact the apostles themselves would have used, would have been wood. And actually, the use of wood carried on for centuries. It was only really until the 6th century in Gaul, for example, where a mandate went out to demand and require that all altars were made of stone. But actually, in other countries in Western Europe, the Emperor Charlemagne in the 8th century had to decree the same thing to stop people from using wooden altars. So obviously stone isn't absolutely essential for the material of the altar, but the use of stone carries with it much richer symbolism. And even with a wooden altar, what they call a portable altar, it's a really nice idea to have an altar stone set in the middle of it. Even though that's no longer absolutely required, it's still a venerable practice and it's worthwhile doing. You'll notice in the altar there are 5 crosses. Those represent the 5 wounds of Christ. The tradition of using stone for altars appears to have come from offering Mass on the Arcosolium, the area above the martyrs' tombs in the catacombs in Rome. And this is a tradition, well, it wasn't necessarily widespread. Most of the early Eucharists took place in house churches, not in catacombs. But nevertheless, on the anniversaries of martyrs' deaths, then Mass would be offered on that stone slab. And this appears then to have become much more widespread as the norm. And it is exactly the reason, and we've seen the links with Scripture, with the book of Revelation, the practice of having relics of saints, and in the early church, particular martyrs, in the what's called the sepulchre, which is either in this part of the mensa itself or underneath in the base. The location can vary, but an altar to be properly consecrated needs to have the relics of saints in it. It's going to be a permanent altar. We also see other features here. In this case, the sepulchre is down here, but we've got these supports, which are called stipites, and the main base of the altar, again, usually of a worthy material, usually something like, certainly stone, but marble in a fixed altar. Just one final note before we finish. The altar cloths, as we've said, represent the burial shrouds of Christ, and as a result they should always be white, ideally made of linen really, but they should never be the liturgical colour of the day. But in previous years they've had 3. It was mandated to have 3 cloths. And the main reason for that is if the precious blood, God forbid, was spilt, then it wouldn't actually permeate through onto the altar. And because the altar was, in its original consecration rite, smeared with oil, that oil also had to be protected from the altar cloths by a wax cloth as well, which wasn't one of the 3 cloths. But these days the rules have relaxed somewhat, so only 1 cloth is required.